Welcome back to We Are the Weirdos, mister, a podcast dedicated to all things cult, camp, queer, and creepy. I am your host, Hillary Michelle Post, and today we will be examining Jim Henson's 1986 fantasy cult classic, Labyrinth. Labyrinth was conceived by Henson and artist Brian Froud, whose artwork inspired both this film and the 1982 Henson film, The Dark Crystal. Based on Henson's concept, the screenplay was penned by Monty Python's Terry Jones. The film stars Jennifer Connelly in one of her earliest roles, and David Bowie, who also wrote the music and lyrics. In the tradition of Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz, Labyrinth tells the story of a girl's adventure in the fantasy world of the Goblin City and the elaborate labyrinth that surrounds it. What sets Labyrinth apart from its predecessors are the prominent themes of temptation and impending womanhood that made the film very formative for a lot of women of my generation. And these themes will be the main thing I'll be focusing on in this episode. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge something first. Yes, this film features goblins. Yes, they are the villains. Yes, I am aware that goblins have a long history of being used as anti-Semitic caricatures of Jewish people. The discourse surrounding goblins and anti-Semitism is important, but deserves its own separate forum in which to take place. And this episode is not it, my friends. So let's just acknowledge it and move on. Cool? Cool. So the film begins with a long title sequence featuring an original song by Bowie and a CGI owl, which we'll come to find out is an avatar of sorts for Bowie's character, Jareth. Interestingly enough, this owl was the first attempt to create a photorealistic animal using CGI in a feature film. After the title sequence, we see Sarah, dressed as a princess, in a beautiful park reciting a monologue. Through dangers untold and hardships unnumbered, I have fought my way here to the castle beyond the Goblin City, to take back the child that you have stolen. For my will is as strong as yours, and my kingdom is as great. You have no power over me. And while Sarah recites the monologue, we see her reference a small book entitled The Labyrinth to help her remember a line. This is the first indication of many that the mythos of the film is an amalgamation of stories, images, and characters that Sarah cherishes in the quote-unquote real world. We also see the owl from the title sequence is perched nearby, watching Sarah. Realizing she's late to babysit her baby brother Toby, Sarah runs home through a rainstorm and is scolded by her stepmother. The two argue, and Sarah complains about the fact that her parents just assume she is always available to babysit. Her stepmother then says, "I assumed you'd tell me if you had a date. I'd like it if you had a date. You should have dates at your age." Sarah's age is never actually stated, but Jennifer Connelly was 14, 15 years old when the film was shot. And though, yes, it is common for girls of Sarah's age to be dating, there's something very unnerving about a parental figure wishing that their child would date. It's an indicator to the audience that Sarah is laboring under this expectation to grow up. We then see Sarah in her bedroom, and it is filled with iconography that later appears in the fantasy world. She has numerous toys, games, and books that later all manifest in different ways in the Goblin Kingdom. We also see an open scrapbook filled with pictures, newspaper clippings, and a playbill featuring Sarah's late mother. It's never explicitly said that Sarah's mom is deceased, but in the long-standing tradition of fairy tales, a missing parent usually indicates a dead parent. we see that Sarah's mother was an actress, which kind of reinforces the idea of Sarah being very imaginative. She enjoys make-believe, not because she's young, but because as the daughter of an actress, it is inherent within her. If you look closely at the scrapbook, and even at the photos on Sarah's mirror, you'll see David Bowie as her mother's co-star. So even the Goblin King himself comes from Sarah's subconscious. The parents have now left, and Sarah notices one of her teddy bears is missing. Now, Toby is a baby. He can barely walk. So it's safe to assume that one of Sarah's parents took the bear to give to Toby. So Sarah's resulting temper tantrum probably has more to do with her parents invading her personal space than it is actually about her baby brother playing with one of her bears. So she angrily storms into her parents' room where Toby is crying in his crib. Toby is played by Toby Froud, Brian Froud's son. In the original script, the baby's name was Freddie, but they changed it to Toby because, obviously, being a baby, Toby would only respond to his own name. So, frustrated with her parents, and Toby's crying, Sarah wishes that goblins would come and take the baby away. And they do. When Sarah realizes Toby is gone, the owl flies in through the window and transforms into David Bowie, aka Jareth the Goblin King. Very early on in the conception of the film, Henson wanted a rock star to play Jareth. Other performers considered for the role included Prince, Sting, Michael Jackson, but David Bowie was suggested by Jim's children, who were all big fans of his. The character of Jareth, specifically Bowie's portrayal of Jareth, is meant to be a symbol for adulthood for Sarah. It's scary yet exciting, mysterious yet desirable. Jim is quoted as saying, "David Bowie embodies a certain maturity with his sexuality, his disturbing aspect, all sorts of things that characterize the adult world." So making Bowie, which makes Bowie perfect for the role, essentially. So the casting of this part was very deliberate, and Jareth's appearance really solidifies the idea of Jareth being an embodiment of a young woman's fantasies. Jareth has 8 different costumes throughout the film. Almost every time we see him, he is wearing something different. Brian Froud explains Jareth's costume as like a composite of several different archetypes that would illustrate adolescent desire, romantic but dangerous. So his costumes have such elements as like rock star makeup, a leather jacket akin to like a motorcycle bad boy, the armor and capes of a medieval knight or prince, as well as like the tights of a ballet dancer. The most iconic element of Jareth's costume, what people seem to remember the most, is his very noticeable codpiece. And depending on the viewer, it's sometimes seen as almost comedic, just because something so blatantly sexual seems incongruous in a fantasy film. But you have to remember that this isn't really a children's film. Yes, it is a fairy tale, but it is about adolescence and growing up. And Jareth's very conspicuous groin is deliberate in telling that story. So, back to Jareth's first appearance. Sarah begs him to bring Toby back, but Jareth tries to distract her, insisting forget about the baby, and if she does, he will give her a gift, a magical crystal orb. When she says no, the orb transforms into a snake. The imagery here is very reminiscent of the temptation of Eve. The orb and snake is very emblematic of the apple and the serpent. Jareth then tells Sarah, "Don't defy me. You're no match for me, Sarah. And this is something Jareth does quite often, switching very quickly back and forth between seduction and intimidation. So Jareth gives Sarah 13 hours to make her way through the labyrinth to his castle to rescue Toby. And if she fails, Jareth will keep Toby forever. So Sarah sets off to the labyrinth, and at the entrance, she meets a cantankerous gnome named Hoggle. Hoggle is exterminating fairies, and Sarah is understandably appalled at this until she picks up one of the fairies and it bites her, which is just like a tiny bit of foreshadowing for Sarah's misconceptions and expectations that are subverted throughout the labyrinth. Sarah asks Hoggle to help her find her way, which he refuses, so Sarah starts off on her own. And the first long stretch of her journey is, unknowingly to Sarah, being sabotaged by creatures who are moving the markings that Sarah is drawing on the ground to help her keep track of where she's going. And when she realizes what's happening, she exclaims that it's so unfair, a sentiment she repeats often. She comes upon two doors that are guarded by two-headed beings that speak in riddles. One tells Sarah that one of them always tells the truth, and one of them always lies. And Sarah, to her credit, is very clever and solves the trick of the riddle very quickly, and she chooses the door she thinks is correct. She turns out to be wrong, which doesn't necessarily mean her logic was wrong, but is just the first of many examples of Sarah probably just being lied to. Speaking of being lied to, something I'd like to point out is that with the exception of one character towards the end of the film, every single character that Sarah interacts with in the labyrinth is male, or at least male-coded. So back in the real world, as a young woman, Sarah undoubtedly is often confronted with men who are dishonest or manipulative. Because, let's face it, all women do. Even characters who don't lie to Sarah often just assume they are smarter than her when they pretty much never are. It's played for comedy and it is funny, but it is also just like a little too familiar an experience. Anyway, Sarah chooses the wrong door and falls into a cavern of helping hands. At least that's what they call themselves. It's an ingenious bit of puppetry, making dozens of different faces out of just hands. It's very memorable imagery, but it's also very unsettling, seeing Sarah being suspended in the air, being held and grabbed all over her body by these disembodied hands. Just the notion of being touched all over by strange hands always freaked me out. The helping hands dump her into a dark cave known as the Oubliette, but she is rescued by Hoggle. Jareth surprises Sarah and Hoggle and asks Sarah how she likes his labyrinth. And like an idiot, she says it's a piece of cake. So Jareth, in retaliation, shortens the amount of time she has to rescue Toby. And again, she exclaims, "That's not fair." And with one of my favorite lines, Jareth replies, "You say that so often. I wonder what your basis of comparison is." That line always makes me laugh because it's so dry and blunt and so true. Sarah continuously has to be reminded that this isn't a game and nothing is guaranteed for her. Nothing is fair. And that fact alone is like a microcosm of adulthood itself, you know. Jareth conjures a deadly machine that chases Sarah and Hoggle, but they manage to escape. And to ensure that Hoggle will continue to help her, Sarah steals his bag of trinkets. And Hoggle yells that it's not fair. And Sarah says, "You're right, it's not fair. But that's the point, isn't it?" So obviously she's finally caught on. Next, Sarah rescues a giant beast named Ludo, and he joins her on her journey. Hoggle has ran off somewhere and is again confronted by Jareth. Jareth gives Hoggle an enchanted peach and tells him to give it to Sarah. And Jareth tells him that if Sarah kisses Hoggle, he will banish him to the bog of eternal stench. And obviously, Jareth enjoys torturing Hoggle, just in general, but this is also a glimpse of Jareth perhaps being a bit jealous. And though he's Sarah's adversary, he definitely wants her for his own. Sarah and Ludo get separated in the woods, and Sarah is confronted by a group of creatures called the Fieries. And they're hard to describe, but they're some of the most memorable creatures in the film because they were undoubtedly nightmare fuel for a lot of kids, my older sister included. To this day, anytime she sees a Fiery, she screams a little bit. Hoggle rescues Sarah from the Fieries, and Sarah is so appreciative that she kisses Hoggle on the cheek. As promised, Hoggle, Sarah, and Ludo immediately topple into the bog of eternal stench, where if you touch the water, you will stink for the rest of your life. So the group manages to avoid touching the bog, and there they meet Sir Didymus, this small fox-like creature, and his trusted steed, a sheepdog named Ambrosius. And they join the group as well. So by this point, there's a very strong resemblance to Wizard of Oz. You know, we have a heroine, 3 male companions, and a dog. They continue on their way, and Sarah comments that she's hungry. So Hoggle reluctantly gives her the roofied peach Jareth made. She falls into a trance, and Jareth transports her to a kind of living fantasy. It's a masquerade ball that aesthetically is supposed to appear as if it's taking place inside one of Jareth's crystal orbs. And instead of goblins, the ball is populated by human adults, all wearing goblin-inspired Venetian masks. And the imagery is very overtly adult. You know, the women's dresses are elaborate but very revealing. Everyone is kind of entwined together and draped across one another. They're all laughing in a slightly menacing, mocking way. It's all very bacchanalian, but still romantic and trance-like. And this is, in essence, a seduction scene. You know, Jareth has manifested this very adult fantasy with which he hopes to both distract and seduce Sarah. And though it is clearly very manipulative and predatory, the song in the scene is very much a love song. You know, depending on your level of cynicism, you begin to believe that Jareth loves Sarah. Of course, if you examine this relationship realistically, the age difference is clearly very problematic. But for the sake of this conversation, we're going to disregard that for now. It's something that we often choose to ignore in fantasy fiction. You know, for instance, Edward Cullen is hundreds of years older than Bella Swan, but for the sake of the fantasy, we tend to just brush it aside. So we're going to do that now. Anyway, the lyrics of Jareth's song to Sarah evoke love and longing and his desire to please her. The lyrics are, "There's such a fooled heart, beating so fast, in search of new dreams, a love that will last, within your heart. I'll place the moon within your heart. I'll be there for you as the world falls down, falling, falling down, falling in love." And let me tell you, as a young girl watching this film, this song could just take your breath away. You know, of course, most fairy tales we watch as girls center around a love story. but you almost never hear a prince or a king singing about how much he loves the girl and everything he's willing to do for her. It's very alluring. Sarah in this scene is wearing a giant white ball gown, is very reminiscent of a wedding dress. This huge signifier of her purity. And as Jareth and Sarah begin to dance, I'm always reminded of Beauty and the Beast. Even Jareth's costume in the scene is similar to what the Beast wears when he dances with Belle. Of course, this film predates Beauty and the Beast, but it's just something I always link in my head when I see it. Because in his way, Jareth is also kind of a beast. He's dangerous and powerful, scary and exciting. But Sarah is able to fight off the temptation, which, more power to her. I sure wouldn't have been able to. I would have fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker, and been the goddamn Goblin Queen. But Sarah, being a badass, picks up a chair, shatters the crystal walls, and escapes the fantasy. She falls and wakes up in a giant junkyard. She's disoriented and can't remember where she is or why she's there. She bumps into the junk lady, who is like the goblin equivalent of a hermit crab. But instead of a shell, she has a huge pile of junk on her back. And she lures Sarah into a replica of Sarah's bedroom and tries to distract Sarah with her own beloved belongings and toys, piling things on top of her in the hopes Sarah will forget her mission and abandon Toby. It's a great juxtaposition from the previous scene. First Jareth tried to seduce her with adulthood, and when that failed, he tries to seduce her with her own childhood. But what makes Sarah so special lies somewhere in between, a balance between maturity and whimsy, which was very empowering to me as a young girl who was very fanciful and imaginative like Sarah. Sarah shows you can still be that and be a hero. Sarah remembers her mission, throws off the toys piling on her, calling it all junk, and yelling, "I have to save Toby." The bedroom immediately begins to collapse, and Hoggle, Ludo, and Didymus pull Sarah out of the rubble, and they finally reach the Goblin City. There's a battle with a giant robot guard, an all-out war with the Goblin army, but our heroes make their way through all the way to the castle. And once inside, Sarah says she has to face Jareth alone. And the next set piece is a disorienting maze of stairwells and doorways based on M.C. Escher's famous piece, Relativity. Sarah tries to navigate the confusing, gravity-defying stairs to reach Toby, but is repeatedly blocked by Jareth. And Jareth is singing a song that I often refer to as the gaslighting song. It tries to frame Jareth and Sarah's relationship as if Sarah has manipulated and used Jareth instead of the other way around. It's the song equivalent of that shitty thing abusive men like to do, where they try to play the victim and intimidate you at the same time. With the lyrics like, "How you turned my world, you precious thing. You starve and near exhaust me. Everything I've done for you. I move the stars for no one. You've run so long, you've run so far. Your eyes can be so cruel, just as I can be so cruel." After the song, Jareth and Sarah have their final confrontation. And again, Jareth tries to manipulate Sarah, saying, I have turned the world upside down, and I have done it all for you. I'm exhausted from living up to your expectations of me. Isn't that generous? No, Jareth, you douchebag, it's not. And fortunately, Sarah sees it as the bullshit that it is. She starts to recite the monologue from the beginning. But Jareth interrupts her and pleads with her, and he says, "Look what I'm offering you, your dreams. I ask for so little. Just let me rule you, and you can have everything you want. Just fear me, love me, do as I say, and I will be your slave." Now, in the words of John Mulaney, we don't have time to unpack all that. But it's a proposition that is both tempting and repulsive at the same time. It's indicative of toxic relationships and toxic masculinity. The idea that women have to be subservient to men to receive their love. But in the right context, it's also a captivating power dynamic, and something that a lot of women actively seek out. You know, for instance, in the BDSM community, for example, this idea that by being submissive to a dominant partner, you're not just giving them the power, you're also giving them the responsibility of taking care of you. And that is a sign of a healthy dom-sub relationship, where it's a two-way street. That's why I think 50 Shades of Grey was so incredibly popular, because of the allure of freedom through submission. Now, unfortunately, 50 Shades does not portray a healthy dom-sub relationship, but that's another conversation entirely. Now, am I saying that Labyrinth is the 50 Shades of Grey of my generation? No, of course not. But power dynamics between Sarah and Jareth are fascinating, and definitely informed my fantasies as a child and into adulthood. I looked up to Sarah so much because she was able to see through the bullshit and reject that temptation when, like I said earlier, I'm not sure I would have been able to do it if I was in her position. So Sarah rejects Jareth with the line, "You have no power over me." And with that, Jareth sends Sarah and Toby home. Once Sarah is back in her bedroom alone, she looks into her vanity mirror and she sees Hoggle, Ludo, and Didymus in the reflection. They've come to tell her goodbye and to reassure her that they're there if she ever needs them. Sarah says, "I need you. I don't know why, but every now and again in my life, for no reason at all, I need you. All of you." That line always chokes me up a little. Like, just saying it now kind of makes me misty-eyed, But Hoggle exclaims, "You do? Well, why didn't you say so?" And when Sarah turns around, her bedroom is filled with her friends and with other creatures and a few goblins. And the film ends with them all partying together, while Jareth, as the White Owl, sits on a tree branch outside of Sarah's window. And that is Labyrinth. This is one of my favorite films for several reasons. First and foremost, I adore everything that came from the mind of Jim Henson. I love fantasy, I love puppetry, I love musicals, I love comedy. This checks all the boxes. And now, as an adult, I can say that I love it because it stars my favorite musician of all time, David Bowie. But in fact, this film exposed me to Bowie in the first place. I was so madly in love with Jareth when I was little. And, I knew Bowie was a pop star, and I had heard his late 80s hits and stuff on the radio here and there. But then late one night on AMC, I think I was maybe 11 or 12, I happened to catch the Ziggy Stardust concert film of Bowie performing at Hammersmith in 1973. And it completely blew my mind. When you're little, the characters in your favorite movies are kind of like rock stars to you. And to see Bowie the rock star, the quintessential revolutionary glam rock god in makeup and elaborate costumes, singing songs about sex and queerness, it completely changed my life. From that moment on, I worshipped Bowie. So, this film inadvertently became my doorway into that world. But on top of all that, like I've said, the themes of Labyrinth are very poignant to me. It's not just about this young woman taking a step away from childhood into adulthood. It's about finding the balance of the two, of embracing the fanciful and the playful, while still having the maturity to be your own person and make tough choices. And while some of the themes I've talked about thus far were intentional, because the creators themselves acknowledge them, there's also so much that one can project onto it beyond the original intent. Like the examinations of power in a relationship, of dominance and submission, the intersection of sexual desire and fear, the concept of gender performance with this highly sexual character like Jareth and his androgynous qualities. There are so many people, when they hear someone's interpretation of a film, or any piece of art really, who have this knee-jerk reaction to be like, that's not what it's about, or that's not what they meant. But art, good art, is open to a million interpretations and means different things to different people. Authorial intent is important, sure, but it's not the entire discussion. However a movie or a book or a painting or a song makes you feel on an individual level is important and is valid. And Labyrinth makes me feel seen. And when you are young and confused and are an outsider, movies like that are so important and stay with you forever. And that, my friends, will be an ongoing theme on all of the episodes of this podcast, no matter what I end up talking about. So that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for going on this little nostalgic journey with me. Check back here for more episodes. I plan on uploading new eps every 2 weeks. You can follow me on Twitter at mxhillary, that's MXHILARY, and on Instagram at ladyxbohem_. And you can follow the podcast on Twitter at weirdos_pod. If you're listening to this on a format that allows you to rate and comment, please do so. I'd love to hear from you. So, thank you all for listening, and until next time, this has been We Are the Weirdos, Mr.